we're going to talk about brain research today. And as you folks know, I do a lot of interesting light reading because of my doctoral program, and so this just happens to be one of the books that I read over the last 8 weeks, along with 4 others similar to it. And this book we're going to look at. God put this in my hand just at the right time to do this, I think. So this is the book is called Created to Learn, and it's written by a pastor named William R. Yount, and he gives a Christian look at educational psychology. So it was really interesting. There's only about 600 pages. If you want to read it, I'll loan it to you for a week, and you can bring it back. Interesting book. So we're going to look at some of the things here. Brain research began in earnest in the 20th century with the development of neuroscience. Prior to that time, we didn't have the ability to really look closely into the brain. We could look at effects. We could look at behaviors that people had and make assumptions. But all of a sudden, we had the ability through the computers that we had developed and everything to actually look into the brain without harming it and see what was going on. And so this whole new science is coming about. And it's just some phenomenal stuff. So I'm going to go over a few of these things with you today. And obviously, this isn't a book about neuroscience or the brain. It's about the Bible, so we're going to tie these back to the Bible, and I think you'll be interested to see how everything ties back in. So again, that was William Yount's book. If you want to see it, you're welcome to when we're done here. I'm also going to refer to a couple other research things that were there. Being a doctoral student, I have to tell you exactly what we're doing here. So one of them is research published by Jeffrey M. Schwartz and Sharon Begley called The Mind and the Brain, Neuroplasticity and the Power of Mental Force. And we're also going to look at Holmes Ralston III, God's Brains, Minds, the Human Complex. And so we'll look at a few different things. Different people have real interesting things to say here, so we'll just tie those in. So we're going to start. There's not going to be a test, all right? So I'm going to hit you with some really big numbers here, and I know what happens when people hear numbers. Basically, your brain turns off, your body goes numb, and very shortly after they're asleep. So what I'd like you to do is absorb the numbers. Don't worry about what they are. Absorb them and be overwhelmed by the enormity of God's design, okay? There are only 30,000 genes in the entire human genome. All right, 20,000 of which are coding genes, about 10,000 are non-coding RNA genes. Only about 17 to 18,000 of those genes are actually involved in your brain, in brain development and running your brain. But according to research by Ralston, there are between 100 billion and 1 trillion neutrons in the adult brain. Let that number sink in a little bit. It's a huge number. Each neuron connects through electrical impulses to a few thousand to 100,000 other neurons. Some researchers say that this totals 1,000 trillion connections that we have available in our brain. 1,000 trillion. How big is that number? It's pretty big. We're going to try and picture it here. The average human heart beats 60 times a minute. We're pretty regular that way, all right? So 60 times a minute is what we start with. That gives you 3,600 beats each hour, 86,400 beats in a day, 32 million beats in a year, 32 billion beats in 1,000 years. I doubt most of us will be around to make it that point. 320 trillion heartbeats in 10 million years. And at this rate, it'll reach 1,000 trillion heartbeats in just over 30 million years. Give you an idea how many connections you have in one brain, right? It's just absolutely incredible. According to Yount, it's mathematically impossible for 18,000 genes to control what all those different neurons are doing. They just could not do it. And yet it's in those connections that we find all human behavior. All thought, emotion, everything. And it's interesting that it doesn't take place in the neurons. The thinking, the thought, the emotion, everything takes place in the space between the neurons. We've many times talked about the idea that God is a spirit. When you look in the Bible, John says God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And last week, we touched on an idea that perhaps this wasn't our initial form, that maybe our initial form was a bit closer to God's. If you look at what we believe God to be, and if God made man in his image and likeness, then this is probably pretty far from it. But the more I do this research and looking at this, the more I'm thinking that maybe the spaces between our neurons are a lot more like what God is. And that's really what we are, and what scientists are finding now, determining that that's where we really exist, is in the spaces. Isn't that amazing? Neuroscientists don't know how genes accomplish what they do. And I love that little phrase, because as I've been a scientist all my life and love studying science, and anytime we get to something that we just plain don't understand, we can't figure out, we don't know it, scientists just love to say, well, it just happens, and then we move on from there. And I always refer to those as the God phrases. You know, to be a scientist, the first thing you have to do is say, there is no God. We can prove absolutely everything. It's all material and all this stuff. You know, just there is no God. And yet, God can do things as simple as putting together a human cell. Now, scientists will tell you, well, this whole thing started somehow when there was a major lightning storm, and there was this soup filled with all these amazing things, and the lightning hit at just the right time and the right temperature and all this, and pow, life began, and all of a sudden cells were created and they started going from there. Yet, interestingly enough, scientists have taken cells. We know that a cell lives very well in salt water. And so we've taken human cells and put them in a test tube and broken the cell open in that test tube. Now you have, at that point, every part of a cell floating around in that salt water. And no matter what they do to it, they cannot get it to reassemble as a cell. Isn't that interesting? They cannot make it do it. Zap it with lightning, heat, cold, anything you want to do. It's just a bunch of parts floating around in there. And yet there still are a group that say, well, at some point there was just a bunch of this floating around and it got zapped and somehow life started. Again, that's the God phrase to me. We don't know how it happened. We do. God put his finger out, or said God spoke and said, let it be, and it happened. So we're going to look at the development of the brain here for a little bit. And it's absolutely, absolutely incredible to me. The human brain starts to develop 14 days after conception. At that time, the embryo is a ball of hundreds of cells. So you've got all these cells that are just dividing and dividing, and it's this ball of cells. But something amazing happens at the 14th day. The ball starts turning in on itself. And it continues turning in on itself and continues turning in until it actually develops into a tube instead of a ball. One end of that tube will be the spinal cord. The other end of that tube will develop into the brain. At about 21 days, the embryo begins to produce protoneurons. These are immature neurons that will fully develop at the right time, but now's not the time. Right now it's just make the neurons, or the protoneurons. The protoneurons are produced at a rate of 500,000 per minute. Let that one sink in a little bit. You know, that's just absolutely incredible for you nerds out there. That's 8,333 per second. And this happens in every one of us as we're developing, okay? Incredible timing. The embryo maintains that rate until the 18th week of development, at which time it then slows to about half that, about 250,000 per minute until birth. The newborn will enter the world with 100 billion neurons, more than 90% of which were made or produced during the first 4.5 months of gestation. Right? Incredible, incredible development. We can't imagine doing anything at that speed. Right? It's incredible. All right. In the second trimester, the protoneurons begin to migrate outward. They've all been in this initial place where they've been making, developing this brain. They begin to migrate outward in an incredible journey. And Dr. Schwartz likens this journey to an infant crawling from New York City to Seattle, Washington, not only getting to Seattle, but getting to the right street or right neighborhood, the right street, the right house on the street, knowing that that was the house he was headed for when he left New York. Nothing happens by chance in this whole process. During this development time, there are 6 consecutive waves of this traveling by these neurons. So they're traveling out. Each wave travels further than the one before until all 6 cortical layers are populated. Scientists, once again, don't know how they know when they're in place. But when they do get to the place they're supposed to be, they anchor in, they continue to develop, and they develop into fully developed neurons that have dendrites and axons, so they can go ahead and transmit and receive electrical impulses. But they don't grow that last part until they're in the place that they're supposed to be. I got ahead of myself earlier. The electrical impulses that they pass, we technically exist in the impulses. We're in the space, in the electrical signals that are being sent back and forth. The rest of the brain's development is just amazing. I mean, if you read through all this and went, just looked at this, it's truly amazing. But I'm going to bounce to a different part. Right now, we went over a whole bunch of numbers and just getting the brain there. We've got a child with a brain. One of the neat things is that brain knows almost nothing at that point. It's a wonderful little thing, but it's there. Most people don't realize that a baby doesn't know where it's being touched. Its brain has not mapped its body yet. And so if you take a pin or you take your finger and touch a baby, it will react, but it doesn't know where to react from. It doesn't know what it is, and it actually takes some time. You as full-grown adults, if you took a pin and touched yourself any place on your body, you would know immediately where that is. But that's something that the brain had to learn as it did all this mapping. So we know that the brain continues to develop for a while. Big question is, how long does it do that? So we're going to get to that in a little bit. Actually, no, let's ask that question. How long does the brain keep developing? When does it finally get mature? 25? 25, 28? Teach? Long time. Long time, that's right. For many years, people thought it was, you had to get past your teenage years and you're finally there. Then we're realizing, it goes continues beyond that. Well, brain science in the last 15 years has figured out it never stops. It's continuing to develop and adapt throughout our lives. And we have a big say in what it does. What's that? We're not going to get to the deteriorating part. We're going to just work on developing. In the 1980s, Dr. Schwartz did some research on OCD patients. These were obsessive compulsive patients. He got together 16 patients who all had the same obsessive compulsion to wash their hands. And when that compulsion came over them, they could not do anything else until they had the opportunity to get something and wash their hands. And as you can imagine, that just absolutely ruined their lives or controlled their lives, let's put it that way. And so what he did is he was convinced that there was a way somehow that he was going to try and find to reprogram that faulty circuit. Somehow a circuit in their brain was saying, you've got to wash your hands, you've got to go do it right now. And he's like, there's got to be some way of reprogramming that, of finding what that is and doing it. And so after a few other tries, he came across the idea and said, why don't we try reprogramming it to do something else at that time? And so what he had these patients do is every time they got that impulse, that incredible desire that they had to go wash their hands, he wanted them to think instead, let's go to the garden. Let's go to the garden. Now, it didn't work very well initially. They'd still go over and wash their hands, but they're at least thinking, let's go to the garden. After quite a bit of time went by, these patients were getting to the point where when they got the impulse to wash their hands, instead, let's go out and walk in the garden instead. something totally different. So he actually managed that. They did that. Now, interestingly enough, he found out that these patients many times weren't in a location where they could go out and walk in the garden. And so they thought about going out and walking in the garden, and that was enough. Interestingly enough, our brains don't know the difference between thinking the thought and actually doing the act. To our brain, it's the same thing. Turn to Matthew 5, 21 and 22. In the complete study Bible, it's in 1390, and the complete Jewish Bible is on 1228. So while you're looking that up, the brain doesn't know the difference. The same area of the brain's involved. He did another experiment with piano players. He took this group of piano players, divided them in half. He taught all of them the same finger exercises, then took the pianos away from half of them, said, you don't get to see a piano for the next 6 weeks. The other group practiced twice a day on the piano. You're going to practice these exercises. The first group was told, practice at least twice a day in your mind. Think about it. Think about going through the exercises. That's that. At the end of 6 weeks, brought them back together. Who was more advanced in their piano playing? Actually, they're both in this exact same spot. It didn't matter whether you did it on the piano or whether you did it in your head and you thought through it. Your brain, again, doesn't know the difference. In World War II, we had a number of people, actually in Vietnam also, we had a number of people who were prisoners of war. And the prisoners of war, I got to experience this when I went through SEER school with the military. We were put in this little box. It's 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, and that's where you lived. And these guys would go nuts in these boxes. And so we were taught some of the interesting things. And one of the best ones was for any of us who are golfers, they say, play the round of golf each day. Get up, give yourself something to look forward to. You're going to play golf. And those who were successful, they wouldn't just say, okay, I'm on T1. All right, I just hit the ball. Now it's down there, 160 yards. I got to walk down to it. Okay, now let's hit it again. That doesn't work. The ones who were successful were the ones who, when they started the round, had just gotten to the golf course, and they could describe the day to you exactly. There's a few puffy clouds over here. The sun's been up for a little bit. You can hear some birds chirping in the trees over here, this and that. They knew what the grass felt like underfoot as they were walking to the tee. They could describe absolutely every aspect of this. And as they did that, then they bent down to put their tee in the ground, and they could tell you what the ground felt like, whether it's sandy or whether it was difficult to push the tee in. And they got the ball set on there. It was a Titleist number 2, by the way. And they'd turn it so they could read the name and then tilt it just a little bit back so they were hitting on the sweet spot of the ball. And they'd get their feet settled for it, and they could feel what the waggle of the club was like and getting everything set. And then they'd come back through their swing, and they swung, and darn it, they didn't quite shift their weight right. The club head didn't make it around. The ball started on a good track, but it had a little bit of a slice to it, and they could see where it's going. They got to keep an eye on it because it just barely missed that one tree, but it should be in that little opening just beyond it. And then they could describe that same way, picking up the tee and making the walk all the way. How long do you think it took them to think through playing a round of golf? About 4.5 hours, because that's how long it takes to play a round of golf. That's the people who learn to be able to do that. Their mind didn't have them in a little box, all right? And so their mind was freed from that incredible box that was just so overbearing, and instead they were able to go out, had a totally different mindset than the prisoners who didn't do that. And those were the ones who came back just as sane as when they went. All right? So that big key, our mind doesn't know what's going on. So let's go here to I don't believe it. Yeah. Matthew 5:21. You have heard that our fathers were told, do not murder, and that anyone who commits murder will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who nurses anger against his brother will be subject to judgment. What is Jesus saying? Your thinking is as bad as doing. Your brain doesn't know the difference. If you consider murdering someone, to your brain it's the same as having done the act. If we move forward to Matthew 5:27-28, you have heard that our fathers were told, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that a man who even looks at a woman with the purpose of lusting after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And we would say today, in his brain. It's already happened. The brain doesn't know the difference between what we do and what we think. Hashem and Yeshua knew the brain didn't know that difference. They knew that clear back over 2,000 years ago. It's neat to me that brain science is just now catching up. Yeah. In a study published in 2000, Schwartz, same Dr. Schwartz, analyzed the difference in brain structure of a group of London taxi drivers, ages 32 to 62, and he compared them with a group of 50 ordinary right-handed men of the same age. Their brains were the same, with the exception of the back of the hippocampus, the part that we use for mapping details. The back of their hippocampus was larger and the front of the hippocampus was smaller. That indicated that apparently neurons were actually repositioning themselves in the brain. The brain was actually changing structurally to handle the difficult task of maneuvering these roads. All right? And then another scientist came to just to make sure that it wasn't something like, oh, well, maybe if somebody's got a larger rear portion of their hippocampus, they just make better taxi drivers. She did some tests to see were they all the same, and what she found out was that the hippocampus changed with the number of years that the men had been driving taxis. The longer they had driven, the more the change. Right? So we found out that there's actually a structural difference that takes place. And what we need to learn from this is that what we focus on changes our body, changes who we are. As Jung says, or Yount rather says, Autospell always wanted to change Yount back to Young, and it wasn't supposed to do that. So anyway, as Yount says, what we give attention to, God or self, pure or polluted, love or lust, dry or drunk, lively or lazy, is the quintessential existential act, setting in force the motions that make us who we are. So it comes down to what we focus on is who we end up being.